The laughter came first, sharp, cruel, echoing through the marble hall, as Imani Ndlovu stood frozen, her worn shoes out of place among polished heels and tailored suits. Her hands trembled around an old phone, her voice barely steady as the millionaire Victor Maseko smirked and waved dismissively. "Go ahead," he said loudly, drawing every eye in the room. "Call anyone." For a second, she almost didn't. Then she pressed the call button. The line connected instantly. Victor's smile lingered until he heard the name on the other end. And just like that, the room fell silent. Before we continue, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Don't forget to subscribe if stories like this speak to you. Johannesburg woke up differently, depending on which side of the city you stood. In Xanten, the morning light slid gently across glass towers and luxury balconies touching polished floors and quiet elevators that hummed like they had nowhere urgent to be. But across the invisible line that divided wealth from survival in a crowded settlement on the edge of Alexandra, the same sun arrived, harsh and unforgiving, exposing every crack, every rusted sheet of metal, every life that had no choice but to keep moving. That was where Imani Ndlovu lived. Her home was a small shack, pieced together from tin panels and weathered wood, its roof patched with plastic that flapped slightly whenever the wind pushed through. Inside, there was barely enough space for two people to move comfortably, yet she had learned how to make it feel like something more. A thin mattress in one corner, a small stove balanced on a crate, a plastic basin tucked neatly beside the door. Everything had its place because when you had very little, order was the only way to hold on to dignity. Imani woke before the sun fully rose. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the small figure curled beside her. Cabello, her 6-year-old son, slept deeply, his tiny hand still clutching the edge of her worn dress, as if even in dreams he needed to make sure she hadn't disappeared. His breathing was soft, steady, the only peaceful rhythm in a life that rarely allowed rest. For a moment, she just watched him. There were days when exhaustion sat so heavily in her chest that even standing felt like a decision she wasn't sure she could make. But looking at Cabello always changed something. It didn't remove the weight. It didn't fix the problems waiting outside that door. But it reminded her why she kept going. Gently, she pulled her dress from his grip and stood up. The morning routine was quiet and efficient. She lit the stove with practiced hands, boiled water, and prepared a simple meal, just enough to carry them through the first half of the day. There was no room for delay, no luxury of slow mornings. Time, like everything else in her life, had to be managed carefully. By the time Cabello stirred awake, she was already dressed in her work uniform, a plain, faded outfit that marked her place in a world where people like her were seen but rarely acknowledged. "Ma," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "I'm here," she replied softly, kneeling beside him. "Wake up, my love. You need to eat before school." He sat up, still half asleep, but smiled when he saw her. It was a small smile, but it carried something that made everything else worth enduring. They ate together in silence, broken only by small, ordinary conversations. Cabello talked about school, about a boy who had shared his pencil, about a teacher who had told him he was clever. Imani listened carefully, nodding, encouraging, holding on to every word like it mattered, because it did. Before leaving, she adjusted his shirt, smoothing it down as best as she could. "Be good," she said. "I always am," he replied with a hint of pride. She smiled, though there was something in her eyes that never fully relaxed. The walk to the main road was long, and the taxi ride even longer. The closer she got to Xanten, the more the world began to change. The roads became smoother. The buildings grew taller. The people walked differently, slower, more certain, as if life had already made promises to them that it had never made to her. By the time she reached the gates of Victor Maseko's estate, the contrast was complete. The property stretched far beyond what the eye could comfortably take in. Tall gates, immaculate gardens. A house that looked less like a home and more like a statement, one that declared power, wealth, and control in every line of its architecture. Imani paused for a brief second before entering. It wasn't hesitation. It was something quieter. A moment to prepare herself for the version of the world she had to step into every day. Inside, everything was already in motion. Staff moved quickly, efficiently, each person aware of their role, their timing, their place. There was no room for mistakes here. No space for distraction. Every task had to be completed before it was noticed, because in this house being noticed often meant something had gone wrong. "Imani," a sharp voice called. She turned immediately. It was Namsa Dubey, the house manager, a woman known for her strictness and her refusal to tolerate even the smallest error. "You're late." Imani lowered her eyes slightly. "I'm sorry. The taxi, I don't need excuses." Namsa cut in. "I need you to work." "Yes, ma'am." The day unfolded in a blur of movement, cleaning floors that were already spotless, arranging items that had been arranged the day before, preparing rooms that might never be used. It wasn't the work itself that drained her, it was the constant awareness that nothing she did would ever be enough to truly belong in this space. The guests hadn't arrived yet, but preparations for the evening were already underway. A major event, important people. That meant everything had to be perfect. By midday, the kitchen was alive with activity. Catering teams moved in and out, trays of food lined every surface, and the tension in the air thickened with every passing hour. Imani moved quietly through it all, doing what was asked, staying out of the way when she wasn't needed. She had learned that invisibility was often the safest position. But invisibility didn't always protect her. In the afternoon, as she carried a tray through one of the corridors, she nearly collided with a woman stepping out of a side room. The tray tilted slightly. A single glass shifted, but didn't fall. Still, it was enough. "Watch where you're going," the woman snapped. Imani immediately stepped back. "I'm sorry." The woman looked her up and down, her expression tightening with thinly veiled disgust. People like her didn't see apologies. They saw position. And Imani's position was clear. She bowed her head slightly and moved on her grip, tightening just enough to steady herself. Moments like that were small on the surface, but they built up layer by layer until they became something heavier than the work itself. By the time the sun began to set, the house had transformed. Lights glowed warmly against polished surfaces. Music drifted softly through the halls. Guests began to arrive dressed in elegance, speaking in tones that carried confidence and expectation. And Imani, she moved among them like a shadow, present but not part of it, visible but not seen. From across the room, Victor Maseko stood among his guests, laughing, commanding attention without effort. His presence filled the space in a way that made it clear this was his world, and everyone else simply existed within it. Imani kept her eyes down as she passed through the crowd, careful, precise, silent. But even in her silence, something remained unbroken. A quiet strength, a dignity that no one in that room had the power to take, no matter how they looked at her, no matter how they spoke. Still, as the night deepened and the crowd thickened, there was a shift in the air. Something subtle, something unseen. The kind of tension that arrives before everything begins to change, and Imani, without knowing why, felt it. Like the ground beneath her life was about to move. By the time the night settled fully over Johannesburg, Victor Maseko's mansion had transformed into a world that felt far removed from reality. Crystal chandeliers glowed like constellations above polished marble floors. Soft jazz floated through the air, blending with laughter that carried the confidence of people who had never had to wonder where their next meal would come from. Perfume, expensive and subtle, lingered in every corner. Everything in that space spoke of control of lives untouched by uncertainty. Imani moved carefully through the crowd, balancing a tray of drinks with steady hands. Her eyes stayed low, her steps measured. She had done this many times before, but nights like this were always different. The more powerful the guests, the thinner the line between invisibility and humiliation. Champagne. A voice snapped from her left. She turned instantly, offering the tray. A woman in an emerald gown took a glass without acknowledging her. No eye contact, no word, just expectation fulfilled. Imani stepped back, continuing her path. Across the room, Victor stood at the center of attention. His tailored suit fit perfectly, his smile controlled and calculated. He spoke with authority, his voice rising just enough to command those around him. Every now and then his eyes swept across the room, not searching but assessing. People like him didn't look at others. They evaluated them. Imani felt that gaze pass over her once. It didn't stop, but she felt it anyway. She moved toward the dining area where another group had gathered. Laughter erupted from a cluster of guests louder than before, sharper. At the center stood Lerato Humalo, a woman whose presence carried both wealth and influence. Her jewelry caught the light with every movement, her voice cutting clean through the noise. "I told you," Lerato said, lifting her glass slightly, "in this city you either rise or you disappear." The group around her laughed. Imani approached, offering drinks. Lerato took one absent-mindedly, still speaking, still performing for the audience around her. Then, just as Imani turned to leave, something shifted. A pause. A hand moving quickly to a clutch bag. A frown. "My wallet." Lerato said, her voice no longer playful. "Where is my wallet?" The laughter around her faltered. "It was here," she added, opening the bag wider, her movements becoming sharper. "I had it just now." A few guests exchanged glances. The air tightened. Imani froze for a fraction of a second, before forcing herself to keep walking. Situations like this never ended well for people like her. Behind her, the tone of the room began to change. "Are you sure you didn't leave it somewhere?" someone asked. Lerato's expression hardened. "I don't misplace things." Her eyes began scanning the room, not randomly, but deliberately. And then they landed on Imani. "You," she said. Imani stopped. Slowly she turned. "Yes, ma'am, you were just here," Lerato continued, her gaze narrowing slightly. "You came close to me." Imani felt every pair of eyes shift toward her. "I was serving drinks," she replied quietly. "And you expect me to believe that's all you were doing?" Lerato asked. The words were soft, but the accusation beneath them was unmistakable. "I didn't take anything," Imani said, her voice steady despite the sudden dryness in her throat. Lerato stepped forward slightly. "Then, where is it?" A silence fell across the group. Not loud, not dramatic, but heavy. The kind of silence that waits for someone to be blamed. "I don't know," Imani answered. That was the truth. But truth in rooms like this was rarely enough. Someone else spoke from the side. "Maybe we should check." It wasn't said with cruelty, but it wasn't said with kindness either. It was practical, and that made it worse. Lerato crossed her arms slowly. "Yes," she said. "I think we should." Imani's fingers tightened slightly around the tray she was still holding. She could feel it now, the shift in how they looked at her. Not as a person, not even as staff, but as a possibility. A problem waiting to be confirmed. "I didn't take it," she repeated. This time her voice carried something else. Not fear, not anger. Something quieter, something that refused to break. From across the room, Victor had noticed the disturbance. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked toward the group with the calm confidence of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. "What's going on?" he asked. Lerato turned to him immediately. My wallet is missing. Victor's gaze shifted briefly to Imani, then back to Lerato. When did you last have it? Just now, she replied, and she was the only one near me. The statement landed cleanly, no hesitation, no doubt. Victor looked at Imani again. This time his gaze lingered, not searching for truth, searching for confirmation. Imani met his eyes for a brief second, then lowered hers again. I didn't take anything, sir, she said. Victor's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A subtle tightening, a decision forming. We'll handle it properly, he said calmly. No one leaves until we find it. A murmur moved through the crowd. Not protest, but discomfort. Still no one argued, because this was his house, his rules, and right now the situation needed resolution. Victor turned slightly toward the staff nearby. Bring her forward. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Imani felt a hand lightly touch her arm, guiding her closer to the center of the group. Every step felt heavier than the last. She could feel the eyes on her. Not curious, not neutral, judging, waiting. This won't take long, Victor said. If you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to worry about. It was a statement meant to sound fair, but it didn't feel that way. Because fairness in that moment wasn't being offered equally. Imani stood still, her breathing controlled. Inside, something tightened. Not panic, not yet, but the quiet realization that this situation was slipping beyond her control. Lerato watched her closely, her expression cold. I want my wallet back, she said. And you'll have it, Victor replied. He looked at Imani once more. Search her belongings. The words landed like a final step. A line crossed. Imani's grip on the tray loosened slightly as someone reached for it. She let it go. Her hands were now empty and exposed. Around her, the room seemed to hold its breath, not out of concern, but anticipation, waiting to see what would be found, waiting to see if the story they had already begun to believe would prove true. And in that moment, standing under the bright lights surrounded by wealth and power, Imani felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not fear, not shame, but something deeper. The weight of being seen not for who she was, but for what they expected her to be. And somewhere just beneath that weight, something else began to rise. Unseen, unspoken, but real. The beginning of resistance. The moment Victor gave the order, the room shifted from curiosity to quiet authority. Two security men stepped forward, their movements calm but firm as if they had done this many times before. One of them gestured toward Imani's small bag resting near the service table. Open it, he said. Imani didn't move immediately, not because she had anything to hide, but because something about the moment felt final, like once she stepped into it there would be no turning back, no undoing the judgment already forming in the minds around her. Still she nodded. Slowly, she walked toward the table, her steps steady despite the tension coiling inside her chest. Every sound in the room seemed louder, now the faint clink of glasses, the whisper of fabric, the quiet shifting of feet, and above all the silence of people watching, waiting. Her fingers reached for the zipper of her bag. For a brief second she hesitated again. Then she opened it. Inside there was nothing unusual. A folded cloth, a small container with leftover food she had planned to take home, a worn-out wallet with only a few notes inside. Everything exactly as it had always been. The security guard leaned in, checking carefully. Nothing. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lerato's expression tightened. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, not in relief but in calculation. Check properly, Lerato said, her tone sharper now. I know it's there. Imani looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time without lowering her eyes. It's not, she said quietly. That should have been the end of it. It should have been enough. But it wasn't, because the accusation had already taken root. The second security guard stepped forward. "We need to search you." The words landed heavier than anything before. Imani's body stiffened. For a moment, she didn't respond. Not because she didn't understand, but because she did. Too well. She had lived long enough to know what this meant, that even when nothing was found, the act itself would leave something behind, something that could not be erased. "I've done nothing wrong," she said. Victor's voice came calmly from behind the guards. "Then you have nothing to fear." The same words again, the same quiet pressure. But now they carried something else. Expectation. The room leaned into the moment, not openly, but undeniably. Imani could feel it in the air in the way people stood a little straighter, watched a little closer. This was no longer just about a missing wallet. It had become something else. A test, and she was the one being measured. Slowly, she raised her hands, not in surrender, but in acceptance of what she could not stop. The search was quick, professional, thorough, and humiliating. Every movement, every pause, every touch watched by dozens of strangers who would never have to stand where she stood. When it was over, the guards stepped back. Nothing one of them said. Silence. Real silence this time. No whispers, no murmurs. Just the absence of what everyone had expected to hear. Lorato's face changed not to apology, but to irritation. "That's impossible," she said. Victor didn't speak immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Imani as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality, one he had assumed and one now standing in front of him. But instead of releasing the tension, he made a different choice. "Then we haven't looked in the right place," he said. Imani felt something cold move through her chest. "What do you mean?" she asked. Victor stepped closer now, his presence filling the space in a way that made everything else fade slightly. "You were near her," he said. "The wallet was there, now it's not." "I didn't take it," Imani repeated. Her voice was still steady, but it was no longer quiet. It carried weight now, a boundary. Victor's eyes held hers for a second longer than before. Then he turned slightly toward the room. "No one leaves," he said again, more firmly this time. "We will find it." A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one objected, because challenging him wasn't something people did lightly. Behind the tension, something else was happening, unseen, unnoticed. Near the edge of the room, Tabiso, one of the junior staff members, stood unusually still. His eyes moved quickly between Imani, Victor, and the growing attention. His breathing had changed, faster, shallower, but no one was looking at him, because all eyes were still on Imani, and that was exactly what he needed. Moments passed, longer than they should have. The tension didn't break, it stretched, until suddenly, wait. The voice came from one of the catering assistants. Everyone turned. He stepped forward hesitantly, holding something in his hand. A wallet. Lorato's wallet. "I found it," he said. A wave of sound moved through the room. Relief, confusion, surprise. Lorato stepped forward quickly. Where was it? The assistant hesitated. It was near the staff corridor. The words landed softly, but they carried consequences. Victor's eyes flickered briefly, just enough to show that something no longer aligned with his earlier certainty. Lorato snatched the wallet, opening it quickly. Everything was inside, nothing missing. For a second, no one spoke, because now the story had changed, and no one knew exactly how to adjust. Imani stood still, her hands lowered slowly to her sides. Her breathing returned, but something inside her hadn't. Not fully. Victor turned back to her. The room waited. This was the moment where things could be corrected, where something like an apology could exist. But instead you can go back to work, he said. Just that. No acknowledgement, no regret, just dismissal. Imani stared at him for a brief second. Not shocked, not angry, but something deeper. Something that understood exactly what had just happened. That even when proven innocent, she would never truly be seen as such, because the suspicion had already done its work. Around them, the guests began to shift again. Conversation slowly returning, the tension dissolving into something easier to ignore. Lerato adjusted her dress, already moving past the moment. The music resumed. The night continued, as if nothing had happened, but something had. Imani turned slowly, walking back toward the service area. Her steps were steady, controlled, but inside something had changed. Not broken, not destroyed. Changed. Because there was a difference between being silent out of necessity and being silent after understanding your worth. Behind her, Thabiso exhaled quietly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since the chaos began. No one noticed him, no one questioned him, and for now that was enough. But the night wasn't over yet, and the truth, the real truth, had not fully revealed itself. Somewhere beneath the surface of what had just happened, something remained hidden. Waiting, and Imani, though she could not yet see it clearly, had begun to feel it, like a shadow that had not finished moving. The music returned before the truth could settle. It slipped back into the room, like nothing had happened, soft and controlled, wrapping itself around conversations that resumed too quickly, too easily. Laughter followed, not as loud as before, but present enough to erase the discomfort. That was how rooms like this worked. They didn't hold on to injustice. They moved past it. Imani stood near the service table, her hands resting lightly on its edge. From the outside, she looked composed, exactly as she always did. But inside, something was still shifting, slow, quiet, but irreversible. She had been searched, in front of everyone. Not because of evidence, but because of assumption. And even when the truth had surfaced, it hadn't changed how they saw her. It hadn't changed anything at all. "Why are you standing there?" Nomsa's voice cut through her thoughts. Imani turned immediately. "I'm going back to work." "Then go," Nomsa said sharply. "Guests are waiting." There was no softness in her tone, no recognition of what had just happened. To her, the incident was already over, filed away as something inconvenient, nothing more. Imani nodded and picked up another tray. The weight felt heavier now, not because of what it carried, but because of everything that had just been placed on her shoulders. She stepped back into the crowd. This time the eyes were different. Not all of them, but enough. Some avoided her completely, as if proximity itself might be uncomfortable. Others looked a little longer than necessary, curiosity mixed with something unspoken. And then there were those who smiled, small, polite smiles, the kind people used when they wanted to pretend nothing had happened. Imani moved through it all without reacting. She had learned how to carry moments like this without letting them show. But there was one thing she couldn't ignore. Near the edge of the room, Cabello stood. He wasn't supposed to be there. Imani's breath caught for a second. He had come early, likely brought by a neighbor who sometimes helped when her shift ran late. It wasn't the first time he had waited for her nearby. But tonight was different. He had seen it. She could tell by the way he looked at her. Not confused, not unaware, but quiet, too quiet. She walked toward him quickly, setting the tray aside before reaching him. "Cabello," she said softly, kneeling down. "Why are you here?" "I finished early," he replied. "Mama Zola brought me." His voice was calm, but his eyes didn't leave her face. "I saw them," he added. Imani felt something tighten in her chest. "What did you see?" she asked gently, though she already knew. "They were touching you," he said, "looking at you like you did something bad." his small hands clenched slightly at his sides. "But you didn't," he added quickly. "You wouldn't." The certainty in his voice was simple, absolute, and it broke something open inside her. For a moment she couldn't speak. Not because she didn't have words, but because none of them felt strong enough to hold what she was feeling. "I didn't," she said finally. Cabello nodded. "I know." There was no doubt in him, no hesitation, and that mattered more than anything else in that room. Imani placed a hand gently on his cheek. "You shouldn't stay here tonight," she said. "It's not a place for you." He shook his head slightly. "I want to wait for you. I'll be late," she replied. "I don't mind." His voice was soft but firm. Imani looked at him for a long second. Then she sighed quietly. "Stay near the kitchen," she said. "Don't come out here again, okay?" He nodded. She stood watching as he moved carefully toward the back, disappearing into the safer part of the house, the part where people like them were allowed to exist without being watched. But even as he left, his presence lingered. Because now everything felt different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never really had been. But now it was clear. Every humiliation, every assumption, every silent judgment, he was seeing it, learning from it, and that changed everything. Across the room, Victor's voice rose slightly above the others again, drawing attention back to him. The party was recovering, rebuilding its rhythm, its illusion of perfection. But Imani could no longer move through it the same way. Something had shifted. Not in the room, in her. Later, as she carried a tray past a group of guests, one of them spoke low enough that it wasn't meant for her to hear, but close enough that she did. "They always say they're innocent," the man murmured. A quiet chuckle followed. Imani didn't stop, didn't turn, but her grip tightened slightly. Not out of anger, out of recognition, because moments like that weren't rare. They were constant, just usually quieter, more hidden. Tonight they had simply been louder, more visible. Near the far end of the hall, Lorato stood again, speaking animatedly as if nothing had happened. Her wallet was back in her hand, her composure fully restored. No apology, no acknowledgement, just continuation. Imani passed by without looking. There was nothing there for her anymore, only distance and understanding. As the hours moved on, the night deepened. Guests began to drink more, speak louder, relax into the safety of their world again. The tension had dissolved completely for them, but for Imani it remained. Not sharp, not overwhelming, but present, like something that refused to be ignored. Near midnight, the staff gathered briefly in the service area, taking a moment to breathe between tasks. No one spoke about what had happened, not directly, but the silence carried it anyway. Tabiso stood among them, quiet, avoiding eye contact. Imani noticed, just for a second. Something about him felt off. Not obvious, not clear, but enough to register. She didn't say anything, didn't act on it. But the feeling stayed, because sometimes truth didn't announce itself. It revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, and tonight had already proven that not everything was what it seemed. As she picked up another tray, preparing to step back into the hall, a voice behind her spoke, light mocking. "You should be grateful," one of the other staff members said quietly. "Things could have gone worse." Imani turned slightly. "What do you mean?" she asked. The woman shrugged. "You still have your job." It was said as comfort, but it didn't feel like it, because it wasn't about the job. It had never been about the job. Imani nodded once, then turned away. She didn't argue, didn't explain, because some things couldn't be understood by people who hadn't felt them. As she stepped back into the hall, the music swelled again, filling the space with something bright and artificial. But beneath it, something else was building. Unseen, unspoken, And this time, it wasn't going to stay hidden. By the time the clock in the hallway edged past midnight, the party had crossed into that dangerous space between elegance and excess. Voices were louder now. Laughter carried further. Movements became less controlled, more careless. The careful image Victor Maseko had constructed for the evening was beginning to loosen at the edges, but not enough for anyone to admit it. Imani noticed it in the small things. A guest placing a glass too hard on a tray. Another speaking sharply to a waiter over nothing. A woman nearly stumbling in her heels and laughing it off as if grace was something she could afford to lose. This was the part of the night where people forgot to pretend. And yet even in this loosened state, one thing remained unchanged. The distance between people like them and people like her. Imani moved quietly between groups, collecting empty glasses, replacing them with full ones. Her body followed routine, but her mind stayed alert. Because something hadn't settled. Not since the wallet incident. Not since the way it had ended. Her eyes flicked once more toward the service corridor. Cabello was still there. Safe. She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Then, a sharp voice cut through the room again. "Where is she?" The music faltered slightly as heads turned. Victor. His tone was no longer calm. It carried irritation, now thin-controlled but unmistakable. Imani felt it before she even turned. Something had shifted again. "I'm here, sir," she said, stepping forward. Victor looked at her directly this time, his gaze sharper than before. "Come here." The room didn't go silent, but it quieted enough. Enough for people to notice, enough for attention to gather again. Imani walked toward him, her steps steady despite the sudden tightening in her chest. "What is it, sir?" she asked. Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly at the guests around him, then back at her. "There's been another issue," he said. The words landed slowly, carefully, but they carried weight. Imani's stomach dropped. What kind of issue, she asked. Victor's jaw tightened slightly. "A watch is missing," he said. A ripple moved through the nearby guests, not loud, but immediate. And once again, the pattern began. Imani felt it before anyone spoke. That shift, that invisible line being drawn. Again. She started. "I didn't say you did," Victor interrupted, but the way he said it made it sound like he had, or at least like he was willing to believe it. "Then why am I here?" she asked quietly. Victor took a step closer. "Because you were near the table where it was last seen," he said. The explanation was simple, logical, and deeply familiar. Imani exhaled slowly. "This is the same as before," she said. "You found the wallet." "This is not the same," Victor replied. His voice dropped slightly. Lower, more controlled. "The watch is worth more." The words hung in the air, and with them, the implication. The stakes had changed, which meant so had the consequences. Around them, the guests leaned in again, drawn by the tension, the unfolding drama that had now returned for a second act. One man chuckled quietly under his breath. Twice in one night he muttered. Imani heard it. Everyone did. Victor's gaze didn't leave her. "Do you understand how this looks?" he asked. Imani met his eyes. "For you," she replied softly, "or for me?" Something flickered in Victor's expression. Just for a second. But it was there. Then it disappeared. "I'm not interested in arguments," he said. "I'm interested in answers." "So am I," Imani said. The words surprised even her, not because they were wrong, but because she had said them out loud. Victor studied her more carefully now, as if seeing something he hadn't expected. "You're becoming difficult," he said. "No," Imani replied. Her voice didn't rise, didn't shake. "I'm becoming clear." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer just a situation. It was becoming something else. Something personal. Victor's expression hardened. "Enough," he said. He turned slightly, gesturing toward security again. "We will handle this properly." Imani's chest tightened. Again. The same process, the same humiliation. But this time something inside her didn't fold the way it had before. "This isn't right," she said. Victor didn't respond. "Sir," she continued, "you already searched me once tonight. You found nothing. And yet here we are again," Victor replied. His voice was calm, but final. Imani's hands curled slightly at her sides. Around her the room held its breath once more, waiting, watching, and then, from somewhere behind the crowd, a voice spoke, low, mocking. "Why don't you just call someone to clear your name?" A few people laughed, softly, but enough. Victor's lips curved slightly, not into a full smile, but close. "Yes," he said, turning back to her. "Why don't you?" The words were deliberate now, calculated, a challenge disguised as a suggestion. "If you're so certain," he continued, "go ahead." The room stilled, every eye on her again. "Call anyone." The phrase landed heavier this time. Not casual, not dismissive, a test, a trap, or both. Imani stood still. Her heart pounded once, twice, then steadied, because suddenly everything became clear. This wasn't about the watch. It wasn't even about the wallet. It was about power, about control, about proving something in front of people who expected a certain outcome. And she was supposed to play her part, stay quiet, stay small, accept it. But something had changed, not in the room, in her. She thought of Cabello, of the way he had looked at her earlier, the certainty in his voice. "I know. That's simple. That's strong." Imani reached slowly into her pocket. The movement was small, but it shifted the air instantly. Some guests leaned forward. Others exchanged glances. Victor watched closely now, curious, confident, still certain of how this would end. Imani pulled out her phone. Old, scratched, out of place in a room filled with polished perfection. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a second. Just one. Then she pressed. The call began to ring, soft, almost unnoticed at first. But in the silence that followed, it became the loudest sound in the room. Victor let out a quiet breath, almost amused. "Let's see," he murmured. Imani didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the phone, focused, steady. The ringing continued. 1 second, 2, 3, then a click. The line connected. And Imani spoke. Her voice was calm, clear. "Hello, it's me." She paused, listening. And then something in her expression changed. Not relief, not fear. Something deeper. Recognition. "Yes," she said softly. "I need you." Victor's smile lingered. For now, because he still didn't know who was on the other end. The line stayed open. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the connection carried through a phone that looked like it didn't belong in a place like this. Conversations faded without being asked to. Glasses stopped mid-air. Even the music seemed to retreat into the background as if it too was waiting. Imani held the phone close to her ear. "Yes, I'm at the house," she said softly. "Something has happened." Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It carried a quiet steadiness that felt almost out of place compared to everything around her. Victor shifted his weight slightly, watching her with a measured expression. There was still amusement in his eyes, but now it was mixed with something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest trace of impatience. "Well," he said after a few seconds, loud enough for others to hear. "Are they coming to save you?" A ripple of low laughter followed. Imani didn't respond to him. She kept listening. On the other end of the call, the voice spoke again, firm, low, controlled. "We do not hear it, but we feel its effect." "Yes," Imani replied, "I understand." Another pause. Then she added, "No, I didn't take anything." Her gaze lifted slightly, not toward Victor but somewhere beyond him, as if her focus had shifted to something larger than the moment unfolding in front of her. "I know," she said into the phone. The words were simple, but they landed differently this time, because they weren't meant for the room. They were meant for someone who believed her, someone who didn't need proof to understand who she was. Victor folded his arms loosely, his smile tightening just a fraction. "Ask them how long they'll be," he said. "We don't have all night." Imani remained still for a second longer, listening again. Then she spoke quietly. "They're on their way." The sentence moved through the room, like a small disturbance, barely visible, but impossible to ignore. A few guests exchanged glances. Not concern. Not yet. But something had shifted. Victor let out a short, dismissive breath. "Of course they are," he said. "And who exactly is they?" Imani lowered the phone, slowly ending the call. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him, fully, directly. Not with defiance, not with fear, but with something steadier than both. "You'll see," she said. The simplicity of it unsettled him more than any explanation could have. Victor's jaw tightened slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough. Around them, the room held its tension, uncertain now in a way it hadn't been before. The certainty that had filled the earlier accusation, the easy assumption that everything would unfold in a predictable way, had begun to crack. Time passed, not long, but long enough to be felt. A minute, 2, 3. The watch was still missing. The accusation still hovered in the air, but now there was something else alongside it. Expectation. Victor glanced toward the entrance. Briefly, then back at Imani. "This is unnecessary," he said, his tone cooling again. "You're dragging this out." "I'm waiting," she replied. "For what he asked. For the truth," she said. A few guests shifted again. This was no longer entertaining. It was uncomfortable. Because the longer it continued, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that something wasn't as simple as it had first seemed. Near the back of the room, Thabiso stood frozen. His eyes moved quickly, calculating, searching for something, an exit, a solution, a way to make sense of the situation that was no longer moving in his favor. He hadn't expected this. No one had. Imani wasn't supposed to push back. She wasn't supposed to call anyone, and she definitely wasn't supposed to sound like she had nothing to lose. Victor noticed the shift in the room. He felt it in the way conversations didn't quite restart, in the way people watched more carefully now. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. He stepped closer to Imani again. "Let me make something clear," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Whoever you called this won't change anything." Imani held his gaze. "Then why are you worried?" she asked. The question landed softly, but it struck deeper than anything she had said before. Victor didn't answer. He didn't need to, because in that moment, something had changed in him too. Not enough to admit doubt, but enough to feel it. Across the room, a guest checked his watch. Another sighed quietly. The longer they waited, the more the balance of the situation began to tilt. Because power, when challenged even slightly, never feels as stable as it once did. Imani stood where she was, still, grounded, her hands relaxed at her sides now, no longer clenched, no longer tense, because the hardest part, the moment of decision, had already passed. Everything after this was simply unfolding. Then from outside a sound, faint at first, easy to miss, but real, an engine, not just one, more than one. A few heads turned instinctively toward the entrance. Victor's eyes followed a second later. The sound grew louder, closer, Deliberate, not rushed, not chaotic, controlled. Imani didn't turn. She already knew. The gates outside shifted, the low hum of security systems unlocking, and then the unmistakable presence of vehicles entering the estate. Not ordinary cars, not the kind that arrived quietly and left unnoticed. These carried weight, authority, purpose. The atmosphere inside the house changed instantly. Conversations stopped completely now. No pretending, no ignoring, just silence. Thabiso's breath caught in his throat. Victor's expression hardened, but there was something else beneath it now. Something new, uncertainty. The first car came to a stop outside, then another, and another. No one moved, because everyone understood, without needing to be told, that whoever had just arrived was not ordinary. And suddenly, the question in the room was no longer whether Imani had taken anything. It was, who had she just called? The engines outside did not cut off immediately. They idled, low, steady, intentional. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong to hesitation. It belonged to arrival measured, controlled, certain of its purpose. Inside the mansion, the silence deepened, stretching across the marble floors and into every corner of the room. No one spoke, because now no one was pretending anymore. Victor Maseko stood still, his eyes fixed toward the entrance. The confidence he carried so naturally had not disappeared, but it had shifted, pulled tighter, sharpened by something he had not planned for. A disruption, an unknown variable, something he could not immediately control. "Who did you call?" he asked again, his voice lower now, no longer for show. Imani didn't answer. She didn't need to, because whatever answer he expected was already on its way. The first door opened outside, a soft click, then another. Measured footsteps followed, firm against the stone pathway leading to the grand entrance. Not rushed, not hesitant. Each step carried a quiet authority that made its presence felt before the person even entered the room. Inside, a few guests exchanged uneasy glances. One of them leaned closer to another and whispered, "Do you recognize the cars?" The other shook his head slowly. "No," he murmured, "but I recognize that kind of arrival." That was enough. Because in circles like these, recognition didn't always come from names. It came from presence, from the way space reacted to someone before they even appeared. At the far end of the room, Cabello peeked out from the service corridor, his small frame half hidden behind the wall. He shouldn't have come out again, but the tension had pulled him forward, curiosity stronger than caution. His eyes moved toward his mother. She hadn't moved. She stood exactly where she had been since the call ended. Calm still, as if everything unfolding around her had already been decided long before this moment. That steadiness grounded him. Even from across the room, the main doors opened, not dramatically, not thrown wide, but slowly, deliberately, and with that simple movement the air inside shifted completely. Two men entered first, tall, composed, dressed in dark suits that didn't try to impress but didn't need to. Their presence was not loud, but it was unmistakable. They scanned the room briefly, not with suspicion but with awareness. Then they stepped aside, and the man behind them walked in. He was older, not frail, not slow, but deliberate in every movement. Chief Olufemi Adeyemi. The name didn't need to be spoken, because in that moment, recognition moved through the room like a wave. One guest inhaled sharply, another straightened instinctively. A third lowered his voice mid-sentence, cutting himself off entirely. Even those who didn't know him personally knew of him. A man whose influence stretched far beyond business. A man whose presence alone could change the direction of a conversation, of a decision of an entire room. Victor's posture shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. His shoulders squared slightly, his expression recalibrating, adjusting to the new reality standing at his door. "Chief Adeyemi," he said, stepping forward, his tone controlled, respectful. "This is unexpected." Olufemi's gaze moved slowly across the room, taking everything in. The guests, the tension, and finally, Imani. His eyes softened, just slightly, but unmistakably. He didn't answer Victor immediately. Instead, he walked forward. His steps measured his presence, drawing the attention of every person in the room without effort. "Imani," he said. Her name spoken simply carried more weight than any introduction could have. Imani inclined her head slightly. "Sir," she replied. That was all. No explanation, no dramatics. But the exchange alone was enough. A ripple of confusion passed through the guests. They looked from one to the other, trying to understand what they were seeing. Because this was not how this was supposed to go. Victor noticed it too, the shift, the subtle change in how the room was now reading the situation. He stepped closer, inserting himself back into the center of the moment. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," he began. Olufemi raised a hand slightly. Not abruptly, not aggressively, but enough to stop him. "I will hear it," he said. The words were calm, but final. Victor paused, then nodded. "Of course," he said. Olufemi turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room once more. "Who made the accusation?" he asked. Lerato stepped forward, her confidence returning just enough to carry her voice. "I did," she said. "My wallet was missing earlier and now a watch. It was found," someone added quietly. Lerato's jaw tightened. "Yes," she said. But Olufemi's eyes shifted, to Imani again. "Were you accused?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "Were you searched?" A pause. "Yes." The word settled heavily in the room, because now it sounded different. Now it sounded like something that needed to be justified. Olufemi nodded once, slowly. Then he turned back to Victor. "In your house," he said. It wasn't a question. Victor held his gaze. "There were circumstances," he replied. Olufemi studied him for a moment, not judging, not reacting, just observing. "Then what is missing now?" he asked. "The watch," Victor said. "A valuable piece." Olufemi nodded again. "And you believe she took it?" Victor hesitated, just slightly, but it was enough. "She was near the table," he said. Olufemi's expression didn't change, but something in the room did, because now the words sounded weaker than they had before. Less certain, less convincing. Olufemi turned once more toward Imani. "Did you take it?" he asked. "No," she said. He nodded. "Once, that was all. No follow-up, no doubt, just acceptance." And that more than anything else sent a quiet shock through the room. Because belief, given that easily, was something Imani had not been offered all night. Victor noticed it too, and this time he spoke more carefully. "We are simply trying to resolve the situation," he said. Olufemi looked at him. "Then resolve it properly," he replied. The words were calm, but they carried something stronger than authority. They carried expectation, and suddenly, the balance of the room shifted completely. Because now the question was no longer about Imani. It was about how this would be handled. Under his watch, behind them, Tabiso took a step back, then another, trying to move quietly, trying to disappear. But in a room that had become this still, even small movements felt loud. Olufemi's eyes flickered briefly, noticing, not reacting. Yet, because the truth was closer now, closer than anyone had expected. And, for the first time that night, Imani was no longer standing alone in the center of it. The silence that followed Olufemi's words was different from before. It wasn't the silence of accusation. It wasn't the silence of waiting for someone to fall. It was the silence of recalculation. Every person in that room, every guest, every staff member, even Victor himself, was adjusting their understanding of what was happening. Because the moment Olufemi Adeyemi had stepped inside, the rules had changed. Power had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Victor inhaled slowly, keeping his composure intact. "We are resolving it properly," he said, his tone measured. "That's why everyone is still here." Olufemi's gaze moved across the room again, pausing briefly on faces that now avoided direct eye contact. "Then let us resolve it," he replied. "Simple, direct, final." Victor nodded once, then gestured toward one of the security staff. "Check the surveillance," he said. Now, the command carried a different weight this time. Not just authority, accountability. The guard hesitated for half a second, before moving quickly toward the control room. And just like that, the room entered another kind of waiting. No music, no laughter, no distraction. Just time stretching again. Longer now, heavier, because this time the truth wasn't just a possibility. It was coming. Imani stood quietly beside Olufemi. She hadn't moved closer. He hadn't asked her to. But the space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like alignment. Across from them, Victor remained still. But something beneath his calm exterior had shifted. His eyes moved more now, subtle, controlled but searching. Not for answers, for control. Because control was something he had never had to question before. Until now. Near the back, Cabello watched everything. He didn't understand the names. He didn't understand the power. But he understood one thing. His mother was no longer alone. And that was enough. Minutes passed. Long enough for discomfort to settle into something deeper. Guests shifted in place, some checking their phones, others exchanging quiet looks that said what no one dared to voice aloud. This had gone too far. Then footsteps, fast, purposeful. The security guard returned, his expression tighter than before. Everyone turned. Victor's eyes locked onto him immediately. "Well?" he asked. The guard swallowed once before speaking. "There's something," he said. The words landed softly. "But the impact immediate." "Show it," Olufemi said. No hesitation, no delay. The guard nodded and signaled to another staff member. Within seconds, a screen near the far wall flickered to life. Grainy at first, then clearer. Black and white footage. A hallway, time-stamped. The room leaned in as one, watching. The footage showed the earlier part of the evening staff moving back and forth. Trays carried doors opening and closing. Then a figure entered the frame. Thabiso. He moved quickly, but not hurriedly, like someone who didn't want to draw attention, but wasn't afraid of being seen. A few guests glanced toward him instinctively. He froze. On the screen, he approached the table where the watch had last been seen. He looked around once, then again. Careful, precise. And then his hand moved, quick, controlled. The watch disappeared into his pocket. A collective breath left the room, soft but undeniable. The footage continued. Thabiso walked away, calm, unnoticed, as if nothing had happened. The screen went still, and the room changed. Not slowly, not subtly, completely. All eyes turned to Thabiso. He stood there, pale, unmoving, his earlier attempts to disappear, now impossible. Victor's expression hardened instantly. "What is this?" he demanded. Thabiso opened his mouth, closed it again. Words failed him. Because there was nothing left to say. It wasn't he started, but the sentence didn't finish. Because there was no version of it that could undo what everyone had just seen. Olufemi didn't raise his voice, didn't step forward. He simply spoke. "Search him." The command was quiet, but absolute. Security moved immediately. This time there was no hesitation, no ceremony, no humiliation disguised as procedure, just action. Within seconds, the watch was found. Exactly where the footage had shown. The proof, undeniable. Lerato stepped back, her earlier confidence collapsing into something brittle. Victor didn't move, didn't speak, because for the first time that night he had no control over the narrative. Thabiso's knees weakened slightly. I didn't mean he tried again, but no one was listening, because now the truth had a face, and it wasn't Imani. Silence settled once more. But this silence was different. It carried weight, consequences, recognition. Imani stood still, her eyes on the scene unfolding before her. Not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with something quieter, something steadier. Because this was what she had known all along. Not just that she was innocent, but that the truth didn't need her to fight for it forever. It only needed time. Victor finally spoke. Low, controlled. "Remove him," he said. Security didn't hesitate. They moved Thabiso out quickly, his protests fading as he was taken through the same doors Olufemi had entered. The same doors that had changed everything. When the room settled again, nothing felt the same. Because now everyone knew, not just what had happened, but how easily they had believed something else. Victor turned slowly toward Imani. For a moment, no words came, because apology, real apology, required something he had not yet decided to give. Olufemi watched him, not pressing, not forcing, just waiting. And in that waiting, there was pressure, not loud, not visible, but undeniable. Victor exhaled slowly. "Then I was wrong," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed heavily, because they had taken too long to come. And even now they were not enough. The room remained still, waiting, because everyone understood. This moment was not the end, it was only the beginning of what came next. And for Imani, something had already changed. Not because the truth had been revealed, but because for the first time that night, it had been seen. The words "I was wrong" lingered in the air far longer than Victor Maseko intended. They did not dissolve into the room like his earlier commands. They did not restore balance. If anything, they exposed how fragile that balance had always been. Because now everyone in that space understood something they hadn't before. Not just that a mistake had been made, but that it had been made easily, confidently, and without hesitation. And that changed how they looked at everything. Victor stood still, his gaze fixed on Imani as if expecting something in return, acknowledgement perhaps, or acceptance. But Imani didn't respond immediately. She didn't nod. She didn't speak. She simply stood there, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. Because the moment was no longer about proving anything. That part was over. Now it was about something else, something deeper, something that couldn't be undone with a single sentence. Around them, the guests shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others watched more closely than before, as if witnessing something they didn't fully understand, but couldn't ignore. Lerato Kumalo stepped back further into the crowd, her earlier certainty gone, replaced by a tight silence. She adjusted her bracelet slightly, a small gesture meant to regain composure, but her eyes betrayed her. She knew. Everyone knew. Imani turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting across the room, not searching, not accusing, but observing. This was the same room, the same people, the same space where she had stood minutes ago under suspicion, and yet now, it felt different, not because the room had changed, but because the illusion inside it had cracked. Olufemi Adeyemi stepped forward slowly. He didn't raise his voice, didn't command attention, but attention came to him anyway. "That is not enough," he said. The statement was calm, but firm. Victor's eyes flickered. "What do you mean?" he asked. Olufemi turned slightly toward him, his expression steady. "You accused her," he said, "publicly." Victor inhaled, holding his composure. The situation required. No, Olufemi interrupted. One word, precise, controlled, but absolute. The situation revealed something, he continued. "And now it requires correction." The room tightened again, because now the focus had shifted, not to the crime, but to the consequence. Victor's jaw set slightly. "I acknowledged the mistake," he said. "And she endured it," Olufemi replied. The difference between the two statements settled heavily in the air, because one had taken seconds to say. The other had taken something from her, something that could not be returned. Imani felt the weight of those words not as pressure, but as recognition. For the first time that night, someone had spoken, not just about what happened, but what it cost. Victor looked at her again, longer this time, not evaluating, not assuming, but seeing, or at least trying to. "What do you want?" he asked. The question came quietly, but it carried something unfamiliar. Not authority, not command, something closer to uncertainty. Imani met his gaze. There were many things she could have said, many ways she could have answered, but none of them felt right. Because this moment wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making him feel what she had felt. It was about something else entirely. "I want you to understand," she said. Victor frowned slightly. "Understand what you did?" She continued, her voice steady, was not just a mistake. The room held still. "You didn't search me because of evidence," she said. "You searched me because of who I am, and who you believed I could be." Victor didn't interrupt, didn't defend. He listened, because now he had no other option. "You looked at me," Imani said, "and you decided I was capable of something you would never expect from yourself, or from anyone standing beside you tonight." A few guests lowered their eyes, because the truth of that statement reached further than Victor alone. "You didn't need proof," she added. "You only needed suspicion, silence, deep, uncomfortable, necessary." Victor's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show that something had reached him. Something had landed. He began. But the words didn't come easily now, because this wasn't a situation he could control with authority. This required something else, something harder. "I didn't think," he said, finally. Imani nodded once. That's the problem. The simplicity of her response carried more weight than anger ever could. Behind her, Cabello stepped slightly closer from the corridor, drawn again by the quiet intensity of the moment. He watched his mother, and for the first time that night, he saw something new. Not just strength, but voice. Victor noticed him too, a small boy, standing quietly, watching everything, understanding more than he should, and suddenly the situation shifted again. Not in power, in perspective. "Is that your son?" Victor asked. "Yes," Imani replied. Victor looked at Cabello for a long second, then back at her. "He saw this?" he asked. Imani didn't answer. She didn't need to, because the answer was already there. In the way Cabello stood, in the way he watched, in the way he didn't look away. Victor exhaled slowly, and for the first time that night his composure cracked. Not visibly, not dramatically, but internally. Because now the weight of what had happened was no longer abstract. It had a witness, a child, a memory that would not fade easily. He started again, but this time the words came differently. Not controlled, not calculated. "I'm sorry." The room didn't react, because this apology was different. Not perfect, not complete, but real. Imani looked at him, studied the words, not just how they sounded, but where they came from. Then she nodded, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in acknowledgement, because sometimes that was the first step. Olufemi watched the exchange quietly. He didn't intervene, didn't guide it, because this part had to happen without him. After a moment, he spoke again. "This should not happen again," he said. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a warning, it was a standard, and everyone in that room understood it. Victor nodded once. "It won't," he said. And this time there was no room for doubt, because now he knew what it meant. The room slowly began to breathe again, not returning to what it had been, but moving forward, changed. As Imani stepped back, the weight of the night settled differently on her shoulders. Not lighter, but clearer, because something had been taken from her. Yes, but something else had been revealed, and that could not be taken away again. The room did not return to what it had been. Even as conversations slowly resumed and glasses were lifted again, something remained unsettled, like a faint crack running through polished marble, barely visible but impossible to ignore once seen. People spoke more carefully now, laughed a little softer, watched a little more closely, because what had unfolded in front of them was not just an incident, it was a mirror, and not everyone liked what they had seen reflected in it. Imani stepped away from the center of the room, her movements calm, unhurried. Cabello met her halfway, his small hand, finding hers without hesitation. "You're okay?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried more concern than any adult in that room had shown earlier. "I am," she replied gently. He nodded, though his eyes still searched her face as if trying to understand something that didn't fully make sense to him. "They said you did something bad," he said. Imani knelt down to his level, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "And what do you think she asked?" Cabello didn't hesitate. "I know you didn't." The certainty in his answer made something inside her soften, not because she needed validation, but because it reminded her that truth didn't always need to be proven loudly. Sometimes it simply needed to be held by someone who believed. She smiled faintly. "Then that's enough," she said. Behind them, Olufemi Adeyemi stood near the edge of the room, speaking quietly with one of his associates. But his attention hadn't fully left Imani. It hadn't since he arrived. Victor remained where he was, though the center of attention had shifted away from him. For a man used to commanding every room he entered, the unfamiliar absence of control felt heavier than any accusation. He glanced around, at the guests, at the staff, at the subtle distance that had formed not physically but socially. Respect had not disappeared, but it had changed, and he could feel it. After a moment, he began walking toward Imani, not with the same confidence as before, not with the same ease, but with intention. Imani noticed him approaching. She stood slowly, her hand still holding Cabello's. Victor stopped a few steps away. Up close, the difference in their worlds was still visible. His tailored suit, her worn uniform, the contrast of everything they represented. But now, it didn't feel as wide. "I'd like to speak with you," he said. His voice was quieter than before, less performative. Imani glanced at Cabello, then back at him. "Here," she asked. Victor hesitated, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said, somewhere quieter. Imani considered for a moment, then nodded. "Cabello, stay with Mama Zola in the kitchen," she said gently. "I'll come back soon." He didn't argue, didn't question. He simply nodded and walked back toward the service corridor, glancing over his shoulder once, before disappearing from view. Imani turned back to Victor. "Let's go," she said. They walked through a side hallway, away from the noise, the eyes, the weight of the room. The difference was immediate. The air felt stiller, quieter, more honest. Victor stopped near a window that overlooked the darkened garden outside. For a moment, he didn't speak. He simply stood there, as if trying to find the right words, or perhaps trying to understand something he had never needed to understand before. "I built everything you see here," he said finally, his voice low. Imani didn't respond. "I worked for it," he continued. "Every piece of it. I don't doubt that," she said. Victor turned slightly toward her, But tonight, he added, it didn't matter. Imani watched him. It mattered, she said, just not in the way you thought. He frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means, she replied, that everything you built gave you power, but it also gave you assumptions. Victor's expression tightened. You think I judged you because you're poor. I know you did, she said. No hesitation, no accusation, just truth. He looked away, briefly, out the window, at the darkness beyond the glass. I didn't see it that way, he admitted. That's the problem, Imani said. The words weren't harsh, but they were direct. Not seeing it doesn't mean it isn't there. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but heavy, because now there was nothing left to hide behind. Victor exhaled slowly. When I was younger, he said, I had nothing. Imani raised an eyebrow slightly. He continued, no one gave me anything. No one helped me. I had to fight for everything I have. And now, she asked. Victor hesitated. I don't fight the same way anymore, he said. Imani nodded. Exactly. He looked at her again. What do you mean? It means, she said, you forgot what it feels like to be the one being questioned. Not because of what you did, but because of who you are. The words landed deeper this time. Because they reached a place he hadn't protected. A place he hadn't expected anyone to touch. Victor didn't respond immediately. Because for the first time, he didn't have an answer. Imani stepped slightly closer. Not confrontational, not aggressive, but present. You asked me what I wanted, she said. Yes, he replied. I don't want your money, she said. I don't want your apology to fix everything. Victor listened. I want you to remember this moment, she continued. The next time you look at someone like me. The words were simple, but they carried weight that went beyond the room they stood in. Victor nodded slowly. I will, he said. This time it wasn't just something he said. It was something he understood. From the doorway, a quiet knock broke the moment. One of Olufemi's associates stood there. Sir, he said softly, addressing Victor. Chief Adeyemi is leaving. Victor glanced at Imani, then back toward the door. I'll be there, he said. The man nodded and stepped away. Victor turned back to Imani. Thank you, he said. Imani looked at him. For what? For not turning this into something else, he replied. She held his gaze for a moment, then said quietly, I didn't do it for you. Victor nodded. I know. They stood there for a second longer. Then Imani turned and walked back toward the kitchen, back to her son, back to the part of her life that had never changed. But as she moved through the hallway, something felt different. Not lighter, not easier, but clearer. Because tonight she hadn't just endured something, she had spoken, and in doing so, she had changed something. Not just in him, but in herself. By the time Imani returned to the kitchen, the noise from the main hall had softened into something distant, almost unreal, like the echo of a world that no longer fully belonged to her. Cabello was sitting on a low stool near the back, his legs swinging gently, a half-eaten piece of bread in his hand. Mama Zola stood nearby, watching him with quiet care. Her face lined with years of understanding things she rarely spoke about. When Cabello saw his mother, he jumped down immediately. Mama, he said, rushing to her. Imani caught him in her arms, holding him a little tighter than usual. I'm here, she said softly. He pulled back slightly, studying her face again. Are they still angry? He asked. Imani shook her head. No, she replied. They're not. He nodded as if that was enough, because for him it was. Mama Zola stepped closer, her eyes searching Imani's face with a kind of quiet concern that didn't need words. It's finished, she asked. Imani hesitated for a second, then nodded. Yes, she said. The truth came out. Mama Zola exhaled slowly. Good, she murmured. It should have from the beginning. Imani gave a faint smile. Yes, she said. It should have, but they both knew that should have and did were not the same thing. And sometimes that difference carried more weight than the outcome itself. From the hallway, footsteps approached, measured, familiar. Imani turned slightly as Olufemi Adeyemi entered the kitchen space. Even here, away from the polished floors and curated elegance, his presence carried the same quiet authority. But there was something else in his expression now, something softer, more personal. Cabello instinctively moved closer to Imani, his hand gripping hers again. Olufemi noticed, and he smiled faintly. "You must be Cabello," he said. Cabello looked up at him, unsure for a second, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Olufemi crouched slightly, lowering himself to the boy's level. "That's a strong name," he said. "Do you know what it means?" Cabello shook his head. "It means given freely," Olufemi said. The boy considered that, then looked at his mother. "Is that true?" he asked. Imani smiled. "It is," she said. Cabello nodded slowly as if storing the meaning somewhere important. Olufemi stood again, turning his attention back to Imani. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said. Imani inclined her head slightly. "I did what I had to," she replied. He studied her for a moment. "You did more than that," he said. "You stood your ground." Imani didn't respond immediately. Because standing your ground and being forced to defend it were not the same thing. "I shouldn't have had to," she said quietly. Olufemi nodded. "No," he agreed. "You shouldn't have." There was no argument in his voice, no attempt to soften the truth, just acknowledgement. And that mattered. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but reflective. Then Olufemi spoke again. "I remember the day we met," he said. Imani's eyes shifted slightly. So did her posture. Because that memory was not one she revisited often. "You were on the roadside," he continued. "Do you remember?" She nodded slowly. "I do." The image returned clearly. The dust, the heat, the sound of cars passing without stopping, and one man lying on the ground, bleeding, unconscious. "I almost didn't stop," she admitted. Olufemi raised an eyebrow slightly. "But you did," he said. "Yes," she replied. Cabello looked between them, confused but curious. "What happened?" he asked. Imani glanced down at him, then back at Olufemi. "He was hurt," she said simply, "and I helped him." Olufemi's gaze softened. "She did more than help," he added. "She stayed." The memory unfolded quietly between them. "You gave me water," he said. "You cleaned the wound as best as you could. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't ask what I could give you." Imani looked down slightly. "I didn't think about that," she said. "I know," Olufemi replied. "That's why it mattered." Cabello's eyes widened slightly. "You saved him?" he asked. Imani shook her head. "I just didn't leave," she said, but Olufemi smiled. Sometimes he said that's the same thing. The kitchen fell quiet again, because now the connection between them was no longer a mystery. It had a beginning, a reason, a truth that no one in that mansion could dismiss. Olufemi turned slightly, glancing toward the hallway that led back to the main hall. "They would have called the police," he said. Imani didn't respond, but her silence confirmed it. "They would have taken you," he continued, "based on nothing more than suspicion." Imani nodded. "Yes." Cabello tightened his grip on her hand. "Why?" he asked. The question hung in the air, simple, honest, and impossible to answer without saying something bigger. Imani knelt down again, meeting his eyes. "Because sometimes," she said gently, "people see what they expect, not what is real." Cabello frowned slightly. "That's not fair." "No," she said. "It isn't." Olufemi watched them, and something in his expression changed again. Not just respect, something closer to responsibility. "You should not have to return here tomorrow," he said suddenly. Imani looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, "you have options." The words were careful, measured, but clear. Imani stood slowly. "I have a job," she said. Olufemi nodded. "Yes," he replied. "But you also have a choice." Imani held his gaze. Choices were not something she had been given often. Not real ones. Not ones that didn't come with risk. "I don't want charity," she said. Olufemi shook his head. "This is not charity," he replied. "It's recognition." The distinction mattered, but it didn't make the decision easier. "I need to think," she said. Olufemi nodded again. "Of course," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. Not flashy, not oversized, just simple. He handed it to her. "When you're ready," he said. Imani took it, carefully, as if it carried more than just contact information. Because it did. It carried possibility. Olufemi turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing," he said. Imani looked up. "You didn't need me tonight," he added. She frowned slightly. "Yes, I did." He shook his head. "No," he said. "You needed someone to listen." The words stayed with her, even after he walked away, because they were true. And truth, once heard, doesn't leave easily. Imani looked down at the card in her hand, then at Cabello, then toward the hallway leading back to the life she had known for so long. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she would walk back into it the same way again. When Imani stepped back into the main hall, the party no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like something unfinished. The music had resumed, but it no longer filled the space the same way. Conversations continued, but there was hesitation in them now, small pauses, lowered tones, careful glances. The illusion of perfection had cracked, and no amount of polished laughter could fully seal it again. Victor Maseko stood near the center of the room, speaking quietly with a group of guests. His posture remained composed, but something about him had shifted. The ease, the unquestioned authority, those things were still there, but they no longer sat as comfortably on him as they had before. He saw Imani the moment she entered. This time he didn't wait. He excused himself from the group and walked toward her. Not quickly, not slowly, but with intention. As he approached, the conversations around them softened again, attention subtly returning to the space between them. Because now, this wasn't just about an incident. It was about how it would be resolved. Victor stopped a few steps away from her. "I would like to address this properly," he said. His voice carried just enough to reach those nearby. Imani looked at him. "Properly," she repeated. Victor nodded. "Yes." He turned slightly, glancing at the room, then back at her. "Not in private," he added. "In front of everyone." A quiet ripple moved through the crowd. This was unexpected. Imani studied him for a moment. There was no mockery in his tone now, no arrogance, just something steady, something deliberate. She nodded once. "Then do it," she said. Victor took a breath, then stepped forward, raising his voice just enough to draw the attention of the room. "May I have everyone's attention?" he said. The music lowered. Conversations faded, and within seconds the entire room turned toward him. Victor stood tall, but this time his presence didn't feel like control. It felt like responsibility. "There was an incident earlier tonight," he began. No one spoke, no one interrupted, because they all knew what he was referring to, and in that incident he continued. "A member of my staff, Imani Ndlovu, was accused of theft." The words landed clearly, directly, without avoidance. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, because hearing it spoken aloud without disguise made it harder to ignore. "She was searched," Victor said. A pause. "She was humiliated." The word echoed differently, because it acknowledged something that had been felt but not named. Victor turned slightly toward Imani, then back to the room, and she was innocent. Silence. Deeper now, he continued. The actual offender has been identified. The matter has been resolved. Another pause. But this one was heavier, because what came next could not be avoided. Victor exhaled slowly, then said I was wrong. The words carried further this time, stronger, not because they were louder, but because they were complete. I made a judgment without evidence, he continued. I allowed assumption to take the place of truth. His gaze moved across the room, not avoiding anyone, not hiding, and I did so publicly. The weight of that statement settled into the crowd, because now it wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement of impact. Victor looked back at Imani. For that, he said, I apologize. The room remained silent, because this was not something they were used to witnessing. A man like Victor standing in front of them, not defending himself, not justifying his actions, but admitting fault. Imani held his gaze. She didn't respond immediately, because this moment deserved to exist without interruption. A few seconds passed. Then she nodded. Once. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, but it was enough. Because acknowledgement, when given honestly, doesn't need to be exaggerated. Victor turned back to the room. This house, he said, will not operate on assumption again. The statement carried intention, commitment, and anyone who works here, he added, will be treated with the respect they deserve. A murmur moved through the guests, not loud, but present. Because this wasn't just about Imani anymore. It was about the system that had allowed it to happen. Near the back, Namza stood quietly, her expression unreadable. But even she seemed to absorb the moment differently. Because change, even when spoken, simply can't be unheard. Victor lowered his voice slightly. That is all. The music resumed slowly, but this time no one rushed back into conversation. Because something had shifted. Not just in the room, in the people inside it. Imani stepped back slightly. Her posture relaxed, her expression calm. Not victorious, not relieved, but steady. Because what had happened had been seen, had been acknowledged, and that mattered. Cabello emerged again from the hallway, moving toward her quietly. Mama, he said softly. Imani looked down at him. It's finished, she said. He nodded, then looked up at Victor, not with fear, not with admiration, but with simple observation, as if trying to understand the man who had stood on one side of something and then crossed to the other. Victor noticed, and for a moment, their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. Of what had happened, and what it meant. Across the room, Lerato had moved closer to the exit. Her presence no longer carried the same confidence, because now she too had been seen, not as a victim, but as part of something larger, and that changed how the room held her. Olufemi stood near the doorway, watching everything unfold. He didn't intervene, didn't step forward, because this was no longer his moment. It belonged to Imani, and she had handled it. Not with anger, not with retaliation, but with something far more powerful. Truth. As the night slowly began to wind down, guests started to leave earlier than expected. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but quietly, one by one, because the atmosphere had changed, and no amount of music or light could fully restore what had been lost. Imani stood near the edge of the room, now holding Cabello's hand. She didn't need to move through the crowd anymore, didn't need to serve, because for the first time that night, she was not invisible. And more importantly, she didn't need to be. The party ended without ever truly ending. There was no announcement, no final toast, no moment that declared the night complete. Instead, people simply began to leave one by one in quiet departures that felt more like retreat than conclusion. Luxury cars pulled away from the estate gates, their headlights cutting through the dark, carrying conversations that would not be spoken openly again. The music faded into silence. The laughter disappeared completely. What remained was the truth. Inside the mansion, the staff moved more slowly now, cleaning up what the night had left behind. Glasses were gathered, tables cleared, decorations adjusted, but the rhythm was different, less mechanical, more aware. Because tonight had not been like other nights, and everyone knew it. Imani stood near the edge of the hall watching as the last of the guests exited. Cabello leaned lightly against her side, his small hand still wrapped around hers as if he had decided not to let go, not yet. "You're tired," she said softly. He shook his head. "I'm okay," he replied, but his eyes said otherwise. Imani smiled gently. "Just a little longer," she said. "Then we'll go home. Home." The word felt different now, not because it had changed, but because something else had. Across the room, Victor stood alone. The space around him was no longer filled with attention, with admiration, with expectation. It was empty now, wide, quiet, and in that quiet there was space. Space to think, space to feel. Space he had not allowed himself in a very long time. He watched as the staff worked, as the room slowly returned to order, and then his gaze found Imani. Again. But this time he didn't approach immediately, because there was no urgency left, no performance required, only truth. After a moment, he began to walk toward her. Imani noticed. She didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't step back. She simply waited. Victor stopped in front of her, his posture different now, less rigid, less guarded. "I've asked the staff to finish early tonight," he said. Imani nodded slightly. "That's good," she replied. "They deserve it," he added. The statement carried something new, not authority, recognition. Imani studied him for a moment, then said quietly, "Yes, they do." Victor glanced at Cabello. The boy looked back at him, calm but observant. Not afraid, not impressed, just present. "You handled this better than I expected," Victor said. Imani raised an eyebrow slightly. "Better than you expected," she repeated. Victor paused, then corrected himself. "Better than I deserved," he said. "That was closer." Imani didn't smile, but she nodded once. "Maybe," she said. The honesty in her tone didn't offend him, because now he understood it. Silence settled briefly between them. Not uncomfortable, just real. Victor looked around the room again, then back at her. "I meant what I said earlier," he added, "about things changing here." Imani didn't respond immediately, because promises, especially from people like him, were easy to make, harder to keep. "I hope so," she said, finally. Victor nodded. "I will make sure of it." There was something in his voice now, not certainty, but intention. And sometimes that was where change began. Imani shifted her weight slightly, then reached into her pocket. She pulled out the card Olufemi had given her earlier. She looked at it for a second, then back at Victor. "I won't be coming back," she said. The words were calm, but they carried finality. Victor blinked once, not shocked, but processing. "You're leaving?" he asked. "Yes." Because of tonight, Imani shook her head. "No," she said, then paused. "Because of what tonight showed me." Victor studied her more carefully now. "What did it show you?" he asked. "That I stayed too long," she replied. The words weren't bitter, they weren't angry, they were clear. "I told myself this was just work," she continued. "That I could ignore the way people looked at me, the way they spoke." Victor didn't interrupt, because now he knew what she was going to say mattered. But tonight, she added, "I realized something." She met his eyes. "I don't want my son to grow up watching me be silent in places that don't respect me." The words landed deeply. because they reached beyond him, beyond the house, into something bigger. Victor glanced at Cabello again, then back at her. "I understand," he said, and this time he did. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. "What will you do?" he asked. Imani looked down at the card in her hand, then back at him. "I'll find out," she said. Victor nodded slowly. There was nothing he could offer now that would change her decision. Not money, not position, not comfort. Because this choice was not about survival. It was about dignity. And that could not be negotiated. "Then I wish you well," he said. Imani inclined her head slightly. "Thank you." The exchange was simple, but it carried closure. Not perfect, not complete, but real. Victor stepped back, giving her space, not out of obligation, but out of respect, and that was something new. Imani took Cabello's hand. "Let's go," she said. They walked toward the exit together, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. Each step carrying them further away from the night that had changed everything. At the doorway, Imani paused for a moment, not to look back, but to breathe, to feel the air outside, to recognize the shift. Because leaving wasn't just physical, it was internal, and that was the real step forward. Cabello squeezed her hand. "Are we going somewhere new?" he asked. Imani smiled. "Yes," she said. "Somewhere better." They stepped out into the night. The cool air wrapped around them, quiet and open, free from the weight of expectation. Behind them, the mansion stood tall, unchanged, but not untouched, because something had happened inside those walls that could not be undone. And as Imani walked away, she carried something with her. Not anger, not regret, but clarity. And that was enough to begin again. The city felt different on the way home. Not because Johannesburg had changed, but because Imani had. The streets were quieter now, the rush of the day replaced by scattered lights and distant movement. Taxis still passed. People still walked. Life continued as it always did. But inside her, something had settled. Cabello leaned against her side as they walked, his small steps slowing with each passing minute. "Mama," he said softly, "are we really not going back?" Imani looked down at him. "No," she said gently. "We're not." He nodded, not with worry, but with a kind of quiet acceptance that only children seem to have when they trust the person leading them. "Okay," he replied. That was all. No questions, no fear, just trust. And that was everything. The next morning came without ceremony. No dramatic beginning, no sudden transformation. Just sunlight slipping through the cracks of their small home, touching the same worn surfaces, the same simple life that had not changed overnight. But Imani woke up differently. She didn't rush, didn't move with the same urgency that had defined every morning before. Instead, she sat for a moment, watching Cabello sleep, the same way she always had. But this time there was space in her thoughts, space to consider something new. Possibility. She reached into her bag and pulled out the card. Chief Olufemi Adeyemi. The name carried weight, opportunity, but also uncertainty. Because stepping into something new meant leaving something behind, completely. And even when what you're leaving is painful, it's still familiar. Cabello stirred beside her. "You're thinking," he said sleepily. Imani smiled faintly. "I am. About yesterday," he asked. "Yes." He sat up slowly. "Are we going to be okay?" The question was simple, but it held everything. Imani turned to him fully. "We're going to be better than okay," she said. He studied her face, then smiled. "Good," he said. Later that day, Imani stood outside a modest office building in the city center. It wasn't as grand as Victor's mansion, but it carried a different kind of presence. Not loud, not intimidating, just solid, real. She looked at the card one more time, then stepped inside. The receptionist greeted her politely, her tone professional but warm. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to see Chief Adeyemi," Imani replied. The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" Imani hesitated, then placed the card on the desk. "He told me to come," she said. The receptionist glanced at the card. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. "Please have a seat," she said. "I'll let him know you're here." Imani nodded and sat down. Her hands rested in her lap. Still, calm, but inside there was movement. Not fear, not doubt, but awareness. Because this moment was a turning point. Minutes later, the door to the inner office opened. Imani. She stood immediately. Olufemi stood in the doorway, just as composed as the night before. But here in this space, his presence felt different. Less distant, more grounded. "You come," he said. "I said I would think about it," she replied. And he asked. Imani met his gaze. "I'm here," she said. He nodded. That was enough. "Come in," he said. The office was simple, elegant but not excessive, a place built for work, not display. Olufemi gestured for her to sit. "I won't offer you anything you didn't earn," he said. Imani nodded. "That's why I'm here," she replied. He studied her for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "I run a foundation," he said. "We support small businesses, people who have ideas but not the means." Imani listened carefully. "I've seen what you can do," he continued. "Not in business, but in character." She didn't speak, because she understood what he meant. And I believe he added that if given the opportunity, you would build something meaningful. The words settled between them, not as pressure, but as possibility. "What kind of business?" she asked. Olufemi smiled faintly. "That depends on you." Weeks passed, not quickly, not easily, but steadily. Imani didn't become successful overnight. There were challenges, mistakes, moments of doubt. But there was also growth, learning, movement. She started small, a food stall, simple meals, the kind she had always prepared. But this time it was hers. Cabello helped after school, proudly, handing out orders, his smile brighter than it had ever been. Customers came, then returned, then brought others. Because what Imani built wasn't just food. It was care, consistency, respect, and people felt that. Months later, the stall became a small shop, then a larger one. Nothing extravagant, but stable, sustainable, growing, and through it all, Imani never forgot. Not the mansion, not the accusation, not the moment she stood alone. Because those things didn't disappear. They became part of her, not as pain, but as foundation. One afternoon, as she stood behind the counter, a familiar car pulled up outside. Imani noticed immediately, not because of its luxury, but because of what it represented. Victor stepped out. He looked different, not in appearance, but in presence. Less certain, more aware. He stepped inside. The small shop fell quiet for a moment, then resumed. Because here he wasn't the center. Imani walked toward him. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her tone was neutral, professional. Victor gave a small smile. "I hope so," he said. He looked around. "You built this," he added. "Yes," she replied. "It's good," he said. Imani nodded. "Thank you." A pause. "Then I meant what I said that night," Victor said. "Things have changed." Imani studied him, and she asked, "And I wanted you to see that," he replied. She considered his words, then nodded. "I hope they have," she said. Victor exhaled slightly. "I'm still learning," he admitted. Imani allowed a small smile. "That's a start," she said. As he left, Cabello looked up at his mother. "Was that him?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Cabello thought for a moment. "Do you forgive him?" Imani paused, then said, I understand him. Cabello nodded slowly, as if that answer was enough. And maybe it was. Because forgiveness isn't always a moment. Sometimes it's a process. That night, as Imani closed her shop, she stood outside for a moment looking at the city around her. The same city, the same world, but a different place for her now. Because she had walked through something and come out not unchanged, but stronger, clearer, free.
Sometimes life doesn't change in a single moment. Sometimes it changes in the quiet space after you decide you deserve better. Imani's story is not about wealth, it's not about power, and it's not even about justice alone. It's about dignity. Because the truth is, many people will never see your worth unless something forces them to. But that doesn't mean your worth was ever missing. It only means they weren't looking. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do
Is not to prove them wrong, but to walk away and build something where you are seen clearly, where your voice is heard, where your presence is respected. Imani didn't win because someone powerful came to her rescue. She won because when the moment came, she chose not to stay silent. She chose to stand, and then she chose to move forward. So if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been judged before being understood, if you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, remember this:
your value does not depend on who believes in you. It depends on whether you believe in yourself enough to keep going. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment where you had to stand up for yourself? And don't forget to share where you're watching from and what time it is there. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue telling stories that matter.